Hey everyone, today I'm going to be doing part 1 of my August reading wrap-up. I've got 7 books to talk about, and they're all pretty different from each other, so I think I'm just going to structure this by favorite to least favorite. So the best book that I've read so far this month is actually a reread for me, and that is The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This was my second time reading this book, but I had remembered so little about it. And I think part of the reason for that is it's not really about plot or what happens. Rather, this is a book that is all about the interior lives of these characters. Virginia Woolf is a brilliant writer. She took my breath away countless times, whether describing the natural landscape and the seashore or the interior landscapes of her characters' inner thoughts and desires. There's one particularly masterful scene where she describes a dinner party, and the first half of this dinner party, basically nobody wants to be there. They're not enjoying the conversation, the people that they're talking to. They are all putting on a show and pretending to get along, but none of them are feeling it. And yet somehow she describes the magic, how when the candles start to glow and you start eating good food together, and how the sense of community and camaraderie is built, and you have this really magical, special moment. You spend a lot of time with Mrs. Ramsay, the mother of the family in this book, and you realize that she's the person that's really working hard so that these important moments can happen. And you see on one side that she's a very generous and giving person, but at the other side, she's also truly exhausted, and she doesn't necessarily feel all that positive or optimistic about her life and the significance of it all. So you can see how she's someone who on the exterior appears like she's just beautiful and perfect and has it all together, but inside her mind she really struggles with what the whole point of her life has been, and she just is so tired a lot of the time from trying to be someone else. But at the same time, you really need to appreciate the people like that are so giving of their time and of themselves to give to the other people around them and create these moments of larger significance. So she's a fascinating character to study since she represents the role of the mother and the wife and how central that is to the life of a family. But also, she's just one of the many characters in this book. You really do get to jump around into different people's headspace. But my favorite passage of this book actually has no characters at all, and it's so creepy. It's about the passage of time, and it's sort of about these winds of change and decay that are creeping into the cottage and showing you how everything falls apart without any humans around, and it's so spooky. And then Virginia Woolf goes and kills off characters in brackets like it's no big deal. So honestly, there are some really creative choices going on here with the writing, and what I love the most about what Virginia Woolf can do is she makes me aware of thoughts that I know that I've had before, but that I just had never been able to articulate in words. So even though she bemoans the futility of real communication, I feel like she does one hell of a job in this book. It's certainly not an easy breezy read. I really needed to sit down and give myself time to process this book, but I think it's totally worth the effort. It is incredible. The next book I have to talk about is The Vine That Ate the South by J.D. Wilkes. This one was real weird, but I enjoyed it a hell of a lot. So throughout the year, I've been reading various types of mythology from around the world. Back in January, I was reading the Norse myths. Then back in July, I was reading the Greek and Roman myths as told by Ovid in his Metamorphoses. This is continuing that tradition, and this book is going to present you with the myths of the American South. In some ways, this is an Odyssey-type journey where a man ventures into the woods one day to try to find some dead bodies in order to defeat his rival and to win back his one true love. So it does have this mythic quest vibe, but at the same time, this is also really just a chronicle for all the strange, bizarre stories that are passed around on various porches in the South. The narrator makes the joke that Homer's tales are called the Iliad and the Odyssey, whereas his are more likely to be referred to the idiocy and the oddity. So that's kind of what you're up against here. Like, these are some very strange stories. I think if you go into this novel expecting it to be linear and straightforward, then you're going to be disappointed, because there are a lot of random stories peppered throughout it since we are getting these different legends. I really enjoyed how this book played with both humor and atmosphere. So while some of the scenes were just so creepy, and you're going through these abandoned graveyards and empty Masonic lodges and the dark woods, and it could be so freaky, yet there were so many passages in here that were just really funny and made me laugh out loud. The narrator is extremely self-deprecating. We don't know what his name is, but we do know that other characters refer to him as Crap Knife, based on a humiliating moment in his childhood. I also love how he can convey how truly crazy a lot of these southern stories are, and yet he sort of normalizes them in a sense. So there's this one passage where he's describing a vampire cult from Kentucky, and he's saying to himself, you know, really? Vampires? Then again, I suppose the small town kids have to express themselves somehow, especially the creative ones who don't go in for sports. I also found many of these similes in this book truly bizarre and delightful, like for instance where they find a dead body, and this is how he describes it. It curls its claws beneath a purple chin and peeks its head out of a swaddle like a ghoulish downy baby. So that's the first time in my life that I've connected the image of a baby on fabric softener with a shrouded, curled up corpse. Really, this book is ridiculous. It's a wild ride, but I had a lot of fun reading it. I also learned that the author is the frontman of a really cool band called the legendary Shack Shakers. So I think I'm going to be a little bit obsessed with this guy since I really enjoyed his book and his music. This was just a really cool book if you're looking for something whack. While we're talking about weird books, let's just continue right on to The Incantations of Daniel Johnston. This was written by Scott McClanahan and illustrated by Richard Cavolo. So this book and the previous one I mentioned, The Vine That Ate the South, have both been published by $2 Radio, a nice indie press from Ohio, and I gotta say, I'm really intrigued with this publisher now because these two books were just so fantastic and so strange. This book here is about the life of Daniel Johnston, who's an indie musician, but you really don't need to be a Daniel Johnston fan to appreciate this, since it's not a straight-up biography, and it's about much larger concerns than just the life of one man. This book is concerned with Daniel as someone who is an artistic creator, and also as someone who is suffering with bipolar disorder. So that's where I think this visual format was perfect. So here's a little bit about what the art looks like. It is these full page illustrations saturated with color and these strange cartoonish illustrations, and they just kind of show the effects of mental illness on Daniel and just the intense way that he sees the world. The colorful illustrations are a really creative way to represent the mental illness, but this book is definitely not trying to take a romantic stance on it or say that's why Daniel Johnston was a better artist. In fact, they're saying carpenters are bipolar too, it doesn't help them make better houses. So they're kind of saying that it's not this really wonderful burst of creativity, but it's also those moments of losing control. There's a scene where he attacks someone. There's a scene where he's flying in a plane with his dad and he causes the plane to crash. So some really terrible things happen. Also, when he's on certain medications, he just feels nothing at certain points. So it really captures those highs and lows of what someone with bipolar might be going through. I love that this book refused to simplify Daniel Johnston. They're really not trying to turn his life into any kind of symbolic narrative. Rather, this was just messy and all over the place, and there were these meta moments where the author is talking about his experience writing this book. You know, this is as much about the creators of this comic and the readers of this comic as much as it is about Daniel Johnston, which was really fascinating. Also, this book has such a strange ending. I will have to say that it was one of the most unsettling endings to any book that I've ever read. So I was really impressed with this book. Like, read it for the cool art alone, or if you're interested in Daniel Johnston, even better. But this was just one of the most bizarre and fascinating graphic retellings of someone's life that I've ever seen before. Next up, I've got two plays by Shakespeare. This is Richard II and Henry IV Part 1. I mentioned in a previous video that I'm getting into a bit of a Shakespeare phase, and I wanted to try out some of his histories, which have always kind of intimidated me. I didn't think that they'd be as interesting for some reason since they were based on real-life source material, but not to worry, these have both been really compelling reads. Starting off with Richard II, this is about a king who's corrupt and has lost a lot of public opinion, and he ends up sort of forcibly having to yield his crown to someone else. So this is asking a lot of controversial questions about whether a monarch can do that, because in theory they're supposed to be chosen by God to rule, but this text is suggesting that if they're not competent, they should be passing it along to someone more capable. I thought this play had a really intriguing plot. You know going into it what's going to happen, but it was still fascinating to see how the pieces were going to come together. And I did find myself feeling sorry for Richard II. Even though he was a crappy king, he had a lot of persuasive monologues and soliloquies that made me feel for what he was going through. So I did enjoy my first foray into Shakespeare histories. I then continued along with Henry IV Part 1. So Henry IV is the new king, and this follows what happens after he deposes Richard II, because there are a lot of people who are saying, yeah, we get that you had problems with Richard, but the crown still should not go to you, it should go to the next person in Richard's line. So there are this faction of rebels that are taking on King Henry's authority. So this all culminates in a pretty intense battle scene. Richard II feels more like a tragedy, it's very doom and gloom, whereas King Henry IV, Part 1, has so many comedic moments that makes this play so much fun, especially when we're introduced to the king's son, Prince Hal, who's kind of a miscreant and he's just misbehaving with his friends in the tavern, which includes the truly iconic Shakespearean character, Falstaff, who's like this overweight, older knight that's always getting mixed up in these schemes and acts of debauchery, so any scenes with those two were bound to be a good time. The king is ashamed of his son that he takes up with such sketchy company and that he makes so many poor choices, but actually Prince Hal knows that when the right time comes, he's going to prove everyone wrong and show them that he's actually a great guy. So you have to go through this play seeing whether he's going to be able to pull that all off. So this was just such a lot of fun, and it led to a really intense final act. So I really loved this one, and I'm excited to continue along with Part 2. The next book that I have to talk about is a hefty one, and that is Barkskins by Annie Proulx. This book follows the descendants of two men who are sort of desperate characters that have moved to New France to start their lives over again, and it sort of reminded me of Homegoing by Ya Jesse in the way that this book was structured, where you've got alternating chapters between each of the two family lines, and also each chapter covers the next generation of the story. So you're kind of always moving forward in time. The thing with Homegoing is that it's a fraction of the size of Barkskins, so you're really only getting this small window into the lives of the characters, which I thought was brilliant because it always left you wanting a little bit more. Barkskins, on the other hand, is a lot longer, so you definitely get to spend more time with each of the descendants, and you get to see more the shape of their lives. What I liked about this book is that you get to experience two very different perspectives of the logging industry. So one of the forefathers is named Rene Sell, and he ends up marrying a Mi'kmaq woman, and his side of the family has to deal with a lot of hardship and poverty. Often it's his descendants that are working as the loggers in the logging camps, doing a lot of the most dangerous operations, so there are a lot of unfortunate deaths and injuries that occur in his family. Also, many of his descendants end up identifying as Mi'kmaq, and unfortunately, as time moves along, the Mi'kmaq culture starts declining and they start losing people and land, so it can be a really sad trajectory on this side of the family. On the other side of the coin, you have the Duquet family. Their founding father, Charles, was very ambitious and ruthless, and he didn't care what he had to do to be a successful businessman. He was going to do it. So this is the side of the family that owns the logging business. They're very associated with capitalism and making a profit, and they don't really care what they have to do or how many trees they're going to take out with them. I seem to enjoy reading about this rich family more than the other family just because there seem to be more plot points. These characters were often horrible people, but they were just doing more things. There were schemes, there was treachery, there were scandals, so I did enjoy those sections of the book a lot more than the more down-to-earth Sell family sections where it's more just about the minutia, the day-to-day reality of being a logger, which for me just was not as compelling. I was worried going into this book that I was going to find it boring, and I did in quite a few places, but yet I still enjoyed myself reading most of the time. So even though it was a passage that I could tell, like, this is really boring subject material, there was something about the craft of the writing and the attention to detail that kept me propelled along and kept turning the pages, even if I was in kind of a slower section. However, there were a lot of things about this book that I did not like, especially the ending. It was just such an underwhelming way to end this epic story, and I feel like part of the problem is you don't get the big payoff finishing this book. Like, I just feel like I didn't really learn all that much about the human condition, since I think a lot of us know that environmental destruction is terrible, and capitalism leads to greed and makes people evil. So, like, these weren't really new messages, so I feel like I didn't need to go through this whole experience to come away with that understanding. This is not a book that I would recommend for everyone, and I could see how this is an extremely polarizing kind of book. You really have to be interested in the subject matter to want to keep going through this thing. So if you don't think that a 700-page family saga about loggers is going to be for you, then I would say don't feel bad about giving this one a pass. But if there's something about that story that seems intriguing to you, then give it a try. I mean, the opening is really the strongest part of the book, so even if you DNF it, at least you'll have had that great beginning in New France. Also, there's a scene in this book where a man gets his wig snatched off, which was a lot of fun, and that's in the early part of the book as well. I'm not walking away from Barkskins loving it, but I'm still glad that I checked it out and gave it a try, because there are certainly some strong moments that occur in here. But I will have to say that my favorite big tree book of the year still remains to be The Overstory, so if you're tossed up between which one you want to read, The Overstory just did this whole environment, trees book thing a lot better, in my opinion. The last thing I have to talk about is a comic collection called Gumballs by Erin, and I'm really not going to say too much about it because I just did not enjoy it. It really wasn't for me. Now, there were a few autobiographical comics in here about Erin's gender transition, going from female to male and taking testosterone and seeing how people's perspectives of him were changing. So those comics were sort of interesting, but everything else just seemed kind of boring and pointless. So, like, there were a few comics about the author's day out in the world. It would be like, I bought this donut, and I went to the park, and I saw this bird, and you would just finish the comic and be like, why did that need to exist? So there were just unfortunately too many that were like that. Like, I just didn't get the joke in it, or I didn't love the art style. All of the heads were really square, so there really wasn't a lot of things that I enjoyed about this collection, so I read through it really quickly and then returned it to the bookstore and got my money back. So this one didn't really work for me, but if you are looking for comics from a trans perspective, then this might be one that you want to check out. So those are the books that I've read so far in August. I'm currently part of the way through the POC readathon. I'm reading some really excellent stuff for that, so I cannot wait to talk about those books in my next wrap-up. I will see you then. Thanks for watching.